Welcome to today's discussion on the urinary system. Today we'll be taking a look at chapter 25 from the Blosson, and we'll be covering sections 25.1, 25.2, and 25.3. Do not worry about any of the content in the rest of the chapter. So you'll also be looking at the kidney and the urinary system in lab, and this information should be complementing that material quite nicely. This unit, along with respiratory and the reproductive units, will be a major focus of the exam number 5. So let's take a look at the urinary system, and we'll start off by just discussing what the urinary system is doing. It is such an amazing system. I think we're all aware that the urinary system is cleansing the blood and getting rid of waste products. That is I think something we all recognize. The urinary system is clearing up the waste products largely from our metabolism. So as we take in nutrition and as our anabolic and catabolic reactions and metabolism are rolling along, there are a number of waste products which to our body are toxic if not taken care of. And so life without the kidneys is incompatible. Kidney failure leads to death. Complete kidney failure can lead to death in less than a week's time because those toxins are accumulating, and also many of those waste products are acidic. And so the lack of kidney function leads to acidosis. That is an acidic accumulation, an acid accumulation in the blood, which, remember, blood pH is typically around 7.4. And if the pH drops below 6.8 or 6.9, you're pretty much dead. So it's a very tightly regulated. So in addition to cleansing the blood, the kidneys are hugely important in regulating the pH of your plasma, of your blood, and share a function with the lungs to get rid of that extra acid. So when the lungs blow off CO2, CO2 in your blood actually contributes to the acidity. So in your urine, you're peeing out acids, and in your lungs, as you blow off CO2, you're also getting rid of acid from the body. The kidneys are also hugely involved in regulating your blood pressure, and we have seen this hormone EPO come up before. So erythropoietin, most of it, about 85% of it, is made in the kidneys, a little tiny bit in the liver, and EPO is, as you know, stimulating red blood cell production. And also the kidneys, who'da thunk it, are also involved in the final synthesis of vitamin D. Remember that the initial steps of vitamin D synthesis begin in the integumentary system, but the final step of creating vitamin D is in your kidneys. And remember that vitamin D is critical for the absorption of nutrients in the intestine. So yet another connection. So when you talk about the urinary system, there are so many connections between respiratory and integument and digestive and cardiovascular. Again, if the kidneys fail, then not only is there an accumulation of fluid, that a fluid accumulation can cause swelling in the body. It can cause shortness of breath because there's fluid accumulating around the lungs. And if you have kidney failure, you're going to become anemic because you're not making EPO. And because those metabolic acidotic products, those acidic products, actually cause issues with the heart becomes arrhythmic. And also those acidic products start causing issues with the brain, and patients go into a comatose state when the kidneys completely fail. So clearly the kidneys are important. Now, the good Lord gave us 2 of them, and we all know that you can donate a kidney and live with 1 kidney. It is possible to live with essentially only about 15% of kidney function. So if you donate a kidney, you've lost 50% of your kidney function. You can live with a relatively unhealthy single kidney. and do okay. It's not until you're down to about 10 to 15% of your overall kidney function that you really begin to see problems. The issue is, however, once you have lost a significant amount of your kidney function, it doesn't generate back. And so, like so many things, once it is lost, it does not regenerate. So let's get into looking at the gross anatomy of the kidney. I certainly hope that I've convinced you that it is a really cool thing to look at. Number one, the male kidney is a little bit bigger than female kidneys. Not surprising. Men, on average, are larger, and so we need larger kidneys as well. The kidneys are highly vascularized. They're receiving about 25% of all of your blood flow. Another name for that is cardiac output. So all of the blood that is being pumped out from your heart, about 25% of it is making its way each and every time to the kidneys. We'll take a look at where the kidneys are located. Yes, they are largely protected, but not as well as some other organs, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. So the left kidney and the right kidney are not directly across the street from each other. The left kidney is a little bit higher. The right kidney is a little bit lower, and that's because the liver is a very large abdominal pelvic organ, and the liver displaces the right kidney a little bit lower than the left. We'll also see that the floating ribs, ribs 11 and 12, do protect the kidneys somewhat, but not completely. The outside of the kidney is covered in a dense, irregular connective tissue shell called the fibrous capsule, and we'll see that as we go through here. And it's sometimes called the renal capsule as well. And then there is a renal fat pad around it. So there's a nice layer of fat around the kidneys helping to protect them. The kidneys are considered retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal simply means that they're behind the peritoneal membrane. And if we take a look here at this sketch, we can see that the kidneys are somewhat protected behind the 11th and 12th rib. But remember, these floating ribs could be basically daggers. So looking from this posterior view, if someone had severe trauma, and it's quite easy to see that the ribs could snap off, and those projections could then sever the kidney, which would be a huge hemorrhagic bleed. As I said, 25% of your blood flow is going to your kidneys. So to have any kind of trauma to the back, the kidneys certainly can be affected by that. Don't forget that on the superior border of each kidney, there are the adrenal glands, one on each side. The adrenal glands are a major hormone of the endocrine system, and one hormone that does affect the kidneys is aldosterone. Now, we will not be discussing this, so I'm not going to highlight it. But aldosterone is an important hormone in regulating your sodium reabsorption, and you'll learn a lot more about that hormone next semester. Now, when we cut into the kidney, and you'll get to do this in lab, you're going to see that when you look into it, the kidney is sort of like the brain. It has a cortex and a medullary region. So it has an outer shell, if you will, the cortex, and an inner area called the medulla. And we're also going to see that there are inside the medulla, there are these structures called renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are separated by renal columns. Again, this will be a lot easier in a moment when we take a look at the picture. And you're also going to see structures called renal papillae. Now, renal papillae, we know what papilla means, nipple-shaped structure. So we're going to see that there's a nipple-shaped extension through which the kidneys are going to be passing the urine as it is produced. Each kidney has between 8 and 15 of these pyramids, so they are variable in number. And we're going to see that the urine as it is produced is sent into a series of collecting ducts, that are going to transport the urine. We'll see these calyces. Recall back from the vocab that calyx means cup. So we'll see these collection regions called calyces, and we'll see how that urine is then transported out of the kidney, down the ureter to the bladder, and then eventually out of the urethra. So let's take a look at the kidney. When you look at your cut kidney in lab, it will not be this colorful. The kidney that you're going to see is really quite unimpressive. I always say the kidney, all the magic of the kidney happens in the microscopic structures. It does not occur in something that you can see. So from a macroscopic gross and anatomical perspective, the kidney is not very exciting. If you basically take a bagel cutter and slice open the kidney with 2 equal parts, what you're going to see are these pyramids. Again, a variable number of pyramids, and they're not going to quite look like what you're seeing here in this diagram. The pyramids are going to be pointing toward the center of the kidney. And let's zoom in a little bit. At the very tip of the pyramid, the apex, that's where the renal papillae is. And the renal papilla is then going to drain that urine into these trough-like structures. Now keep in mind, these troughs have been opened up. So this is a tube-like collecting area. And the first areas are called the minor calyces. So each apex, each renal papilla dumps into a minor calyx. So you can see here a minor calyx, another minor calyx, another minor calyx. And then in this case, these 3 minor calyces merge into a larger area referred to as the major calyx. Then all of the major calyces merge into a very large collecting area referred to as the renal pelvis. Notice then that the urine drips down the ureter. The renal pelvis is in that region of the kidney referred to as the hilum. The hilum, the long-sided hilum as well. The hilum is simply the area, sort of the indentation of the kidney. And here, in addition to the renal pelvis and the ureter, you would see the renal artery, the renal vein, lymphatics, nerves. Everything that goes in and out of the kidney is going to pass through this region called the hilum. If we go back, let's take a look. The renal cortex is simply the outer layer, much like the brain, right? The cortical region of the brain, or bone. We talk about the cortical region of bone. And then the inner area where we see these pyramids is the medullary region. And we see that these pyramids are separated one from another through renal columns. So here's a column, here's a column, here's a column. And then, as I said earlier, on the outside of the kidney, one finds a fibrous capsule, which is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the anatomy of the kidney. We'll take a look, much closer look into the microscopic activities of the kidney. But as you can see, looking at the gross anatomy of the kidney is not very telling. It really doesn't give you much of a clue as to what the kidneys are doing. So that gives us the end of 25.1 just on the gross anatomy of the kidney, and you can certainly answer these questions, do the labeling activities, and check out the vocab. Okay, let's take a look at the microscopic anatomy of the kidney, and this is the area where you're going to spend a little bit more time really kind of focusing in on what in the world is going on in the kidney and what structures are involved. So within the kidney, you're going to see a lot of units called nephrons. Nephrons are the functional unit of the kidney, and the nephron includes the filtering units and the tubing in which the filtrate is modified. So what we'll say is that urine is the final product, but initially the plasma of the blood is filtered, and that filtrate is going to pass through portions of the nephron, and on the other side of the nephron will release the final product, urine. So again, filtrate will be the term used as we're modifying until we get to true urine. And there are a number of, again, other functions that are going on in the kidney. I've already mentioned those in the first section. That is blood pressure regulation, red blood cell production regulation, and calcium absorption. Two of those are already mentioned. You already know quite a bit about EPO and red blood cell production. I mentioned already that vitamin D is the final step of making vitamin D occurs from a hormone produced by the kidney. Recall that vitamin D is necessary for calcium absorption into the digestive system. And then finally, there is a hormone called renin. You'll also hear it called renin. And this hormone is helping to regulate your blood pressure. We will not be discussing the details of renin or of the vitamin D synthesis. So again, when we're in the nephron, the functional unit of the nephron, remember we've had other functional units. The functional unit of bone, of compact bone, is the osteon. The functional unit of muscle is the sarcomere. So this is just another, quote, microscopic functional unit where sort of all the magic happens within this body system. In each of your kidneys, you have over 1 million of these microscopic tube-like connections or structures called nephrons. And each nephron is made up of 4 parts. You need to know this very well. There is, make that one in pink, there's the renal corpuscle. Renal corpuscle. Now, corp means body. So I just think this is the renal thing, the renal structure, the renal body. Then there are 3 sections of tubing. First, there's the proximal convoluted tubule, the PCT, followed by the nephron loop. You'll also hear it referred to as the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. And then finally, there's the distal convoluted tubule, the DCT. And all of these parts, all of the renal corpuscle, all of the proximal tubule, and all of the distal tubules are found in the cortex. That's important as we try to figure out what's going on with this microscopic structures versus the macroscopic structures. And then we'll see that those nephron loops do go down into the medullary regions of the kidney. There are 2 different flavors of nephrons. There are cortical nephrons. They account for relatively, they account for the majority of the nephrons. And they're called cortical nephrons because the majority of the structures are up in the cortex. And then 15% or so of all of the nephrons are juxtamedullary nephrons. The name tells you what's going on. Juxtamedullary. Juxta means next to. So these are nephrons where most of the structures are next to the medulla, and they also have a much longer nephron loop. Be watching for that as we move forward in the labeling. So what's going on? Each nephron is having blood delivered to it from a small vessel called an afferent arteriole. That afferent arteriole, we know afferent means going toward something. So the afferent arteriole is bringing blood into the nephron, into a region of the nephron called the glomerulus. Now recall from our vocab that glom means ball. So this is a ball of capillaries, right? The afferent arteriole is leading blood into a series of capillaries or a group of capillaries called a glomerulus. The glomerulus is protected by a capsule structure. You'll see it credited to a guy named Bowman's. So the Bowman's capsule, or just the glomerular capsule. And together, the ball of capillaries, the glomerulus, and the capsule are collectively called the renal corpuscle. Okay, and that's, remember up here I said that the renal corpuscle was the first part of the nephron. So I've described to you what the renal corpuscle is. It's in the renal corpuscle where the filtering is happening. Okay, so where the filtering of the blood, specifically of the plasma, is happening in these capillaries. Once the blood has been filtered in these capillaries, the blood is going to leave the glomerulus in a second arteriole called the efferent arteriole. Right, so we have the ingoing and the outgoing arteriole. Now, immediately, this should send up some sparks, if you will. Recall that up until now, when blood went into a capillary, it went in through an arteriole, but came out through a venule. Here, we see blood going into a capillary through an arteriole and coming out an arteriole. So this reminds us, or what I'll tell you now is that this is not where gas exchange is happening. This glomerulus is a capillary dedicated to filtering the blood, but not involved in gas exchange. That's going to happen next. So once the blood leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole, it's then going to go to a second capillary network. Right? This is interesting. We're going to go into two capillary beds. First the glomerulus, and then a second capillary network that is either a peritubular capillaries, and in some nephrons, the juxtamedullary nephrons, there's also a vasa recta. Okay, now that's where the gas exchange is happening, where the normal capillary structures are found, and then after all that, the blood is returned back through the venous system, through the renal vein. So let's take a look at a diagram of all this to make sense of what's happening. So let's zoom into this. And again, these parts are really important for you to appreciate. Keep in mind what we're looking at. We're just taking a little tiny piece of the kidney. There's over 100, there's over a million of these nephrons. We're looking at one. Okay, so we're just kind of pulling one nephron out of the kidney and looking at it with greater detail. So here is that afferent arteriole, right? So this is a small blood vessel bringing oxygenated blood into the glomerulus. The glomerulus is the ball of capillaries. We see that here, and it is surrounded by a capsule, the Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule. This is where the magical filtration is happening. Blood that does not get filtered out is going to leave the glomerulus out the efferent arteriole. Again, red blood in, red blood out, still oxygenated. The efferent arteriole then swings around and goes to this set of capillaries that we see around the tubes, and that is the peritubular capillaries. Peritubular capillaries, as the name suggests, going around the tubes. Then you see in these peritubular capillaries some evidence of color change. So these are regular continuous capillaries where gas exchange, nutrient exchange, hormone signaling, all that happens in normal capillaries is happening here. And then leave out through a series of venules, which are not labeled here, but they eventually lead out of the kidneys to the renal vein. Once the glomerulus filters the blood, the next part of the nephron attached here is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule. We know the word proximal means closer to the point of attachment. So the proximal tubule, convoluted tells us that it's twisted. So we see a twisted tube, proximal, at the point of attachment, and we see it kind of wrap around. Then, let's go down. We're going to go down the nephron loop, come back up the nephron loop. The nephron loop is the only part of the nephron that juts down into the medullary region. Come up the nephron loop, sometimes called the loop of Henle, and now comes up to another set of tubing. This is the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. And then the distal convoluted tubule, those are the four parts of the nephron. Glomerulus, proximal tubule, nephron loop, distal tubule. So remember, there are, there's about 1 million or so of these nephron structures That means there's also 1,000,000 afferent arterioles, 1,000,000 glomeruli, 1,000,000 efferent arterioles. All of this is duplicated in tremendous numbers. Once the filtrate has traveled through those tubes, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening as urine is produced, that filtrate is going to be brought into this structure. This is a collecting duct. And I want you to notice that this collecting duct has other nephrons that are dropping filtrate into that. So the collecting duct is not one of the parts of the nephron. The collecting duct, as the name suggests, is collecting the filtrate from many of these nephron units. Then the filtrate is going to continue through the collecting duct. There's still modification happening of the filtrate, so it's not quite urine yet. As we'll see in a moment, the collecting duct is going to lead to the renal papilla. And then once this filtrate drips through the renal papilla and into the calyx, that is then final product urine. So as long as the filtrate is in the nephron or the collecting duct, it's possible that that filtrate is being modified to the final product of urine. So let's go through each of these four parts of the nephron. First part is the renal corpuscle. Again, it is a group or a tuft of capillaries called the glomerulus, surrounded by the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. Those two parts, again, make up the renal corpuscle. Make sure you're watching these videos to really help you visualize this. Blood is coming into the capillary bed under significant pressure, and you know that high pressure in a capillary bed can be damaging to capillaries, but there's a couple very special things about these capillaries. Number one, these capillaries are fenestrated. Recall back in the blood vessel chapter, we talked about fenestrated capillaries. These are capillaries with little holes in them, and we find those in the glomerulus. Also, because think about it, the heart has to push blood into the kidney under sufficient pressure in order for the glomeruli to filter the plasma from a couple million of these nephrons. So to help with that, the visceral layer of the capsule. So the capsule has two layers, much like our other serous membranes, but the visceral layer is not squamous like it typically is, but is actually cells called podocytes. These podocytes, these foot-like processes coming from the podocytes called pedicels, and they cover up the glomerular capillaries. These pedicels, these little finger-like extensions, interdigitate, which means they just kind of overlap to form what's called filtration slits, little gaps. Now, when blood passes through the glomerulus, not only do molecules need to be small enough to get through the fenestrated capillaries, but everything getting filtered out must be small enough to also go through the filtration slits. So as the kidneys are filtering, they're filtering through the openings of the fenestrations and through the openings of the filtration slits. Again, the videos will help you picture that. Here is a really cool rendition of the podocyte. So here's the nucleus, or the cell body of the podocyte, and you see these extensions. These extensions are called pedicels, and you see these finger-like extensions, right? And the interdigitation of these finger-like extensions, and you can see the filtration slits that are formed by those pedicels. So those are the podocytes. And then here is a reminder of what those fenestrations look like. So here is a small piece of one of the capillaries. The fenestrations are these little openings. These endothelial cells are still held together, but they're certainly a lot leakier because of those fenestrations than what would be found in your continuous capillaries. Wrapped around these capillaries are other cells called mesangial cells. Let's take a look at that word. Mes, you know, means middle. Angio means blood vessels. So basically, mesangial cells are out in the middle of the blood vessels, right? And these are smooth muscle-like cells, and they're going to help to sort of contract a little bit, and again help with the filtration process that's occurring here across the glomerular capillaries. So let's take a look at this. We're taking a look at a close-up of one renal corpuscle. So here's the renal corpuscle that I'm circling. Here is a rendition of the glomerulus, the capillary bed. You can see those filtration slits. So this glomerulus has those podocytes covering it. We see the Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule around it. And here, arrow, inward arrow. This is the afferent arteriole. Notice it's a little bit bigger in diameter because it's bringing the blood into the glomerulus. And then as blood is filtered, what leaves is a little bit more narrow of a diameter, and that is the efferent arteriole, again, the outward arrow. Again, notice red blood in, red blood out. Note too, the red blood cells, it's a pretty tight squeeze coming into the capillaries here. Remember, we are not filtering oxygen here. We're not capturing or exchanging oxygen or CO2. We're simply filtering out waste products. Now, as I just described, those waste products, those acids, and those other products that end up in our urine must be small enough to get through the fenestrations and small enough to get through those filtration slits. Never, never, never would a red blood cell or a platelet or a white blood cell or large proteins be able to pass out through these filtration slits and into the urine. Once the filtration happens here in the capillaries, that filtrate is then going to start its journey down what's shown here as the beginning of the proximal convoluted tubule. Note, even in this rendition, the proximal convoluted tubule, it shows here, is lined by a simple layer of cuboidal cells. Back in histology lab, lab 2, you learn that the kidney tubules, here we are, right here are the tubules of the kidney, are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. And even in this rendition, you can see that there are microvilli. Those are microvilli. Remember, microvilli were also present in the digestive system, and their purpose was to increase the surface area for absorption in the digestive system. We also see microvilli here to increase the surface area for the filtration process, not the filtration, but the absorption process that is occurring here in the tubules of the kidney. Histologically, here we go. Here you can see the capsule around. You see that big white space. This group of capillaries, there's your glomerulus. You can't appreciate that they're fenestrated here. And some of those nuclei you're seeing in here would be of those podocytes. And then when you take a look here, you see one of those tubes. And you can clearly see here and here and here and here, right? All of these tubes within the kidney are lined by a beautiful layer of simple cuboidal cells, right? Simple cuboidal cells, pretty obvious. Now, this diagram is labeling this particular tube as a distal tubule and this particular tube as a proximal tubule. Yes, that's true. I'm not going to ask you to differentiate those two this semester. In the wall of the distal convoluted tubule, there is a group of cells called the macula densa. These group of cells here are shown in green down here in the diagram. The macula densa is just a group of epithelial cells, and they're monitoring the fluid flow through the nephron structures. So We're not going to get into the regulation of this semester, but just know that there are some pretty complex processes in place. You'll learn about them next semester that are regulating the blood flow in and out of each glomerulus, in and out of each nephron unit. And that is being regulated by these cells that sort of control the flow in and the flow out of the blood. And again, we won't be focusing on those regulatory processes this semester. Let's move on to the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule is again lined by simple cuboidal cells. They have a lot of microvilli, and those microvilli form the brush border. That is the same story we saw lining the inside of the small intestine. Those microvilli are creating the large surface area, and what we're going to see is that there's a lot of modification going on of your filtrate, where the kidneys are adding and subtracting sodium, chloride, glucose, amino acids, potassium, all sorts of electrolytes and small molecules are being modified in that filtrate. And that's really what's going on here, is we're in the business of absorbing and secreting. We'll go through those words in a few minutes. Then on to the nephron loop, also called the loop of Henle. There's a descending side and an ascending side. So the part that goes down and a part that comes back up. Again, during that traveling down the loop of Henle, there is going to be modifications of the filtrate. We're not going to get into the specifics of that. That will be a significant story in physiology of how the kidney does all of this. And then coming up out of the loop, you now come up to the DCT. It too is lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. Far fewer microvilli because the proximal tubule is not involved in as much of the reabsorption and secretion processes. Also, there are fewer mitochondria. I think that was mentioned up here. Let me just highlight that. There are a lot of mitochondria. There it is. There are a lot of mitochondria in the cells that make up the proximal tubule. And the reason is there's a lot of ATP that is necessary to do the job of the kidney. So these cells have a lot of mitochondria, especially in the proximal tubule. And there are fewer microvilli and fewer mitochondria as well in the distal convoluted tubule in comparison. As I mentioned, those are the parts of the nephron. Once you leave the nephron, the fluid, the filtrate, then goes into the collecting duct. And again, the collecting duct is not technically part of the nephron, right? Not technically part of it. And the collecting ducts are receiving filtrate from numerous or several nephrons that all merge into the collecting duct. We'll see that the collecting duct is going to empty into a renal papilla, and the collecting ducts are lined by simple squamous epithelium. And I will discuss that there is a hormone called ADH, and we will talk about this hormone. We haven't talked a lot about hormones this semester, but ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. So ADH is anti-diuretic hormone, and we'll talk a bit more about that hormone before we're done here. From the collecting duct out the renal papilla, collected by the minor calyx, merging to the major calyces, into the renal pelvis, and then down, leaving the kidney through the ureter. So we've seen that anatomically in pictures. We'll see that again as we go through this. So that is basically what's really going on. You may not have a good sense of this yet, but blood is going into the glomerulus. It's being filtered. That filtrate is traveling through these different parts of the nephron. As it travels through, that filtrate is being modified into what will eventually become urine. And then that urine is collected, sent down to the bladder, and is released out the ureter. Sorry, the urethra. The urethra. Now, in the kidney, we have two things to keep track of. We just kept track of the filtrate flow. Now we need to look at the blood flow going in and out of the kidney. Okay, so in addition to the structure of the nephron, we need to understand how blood is received into the kidney. We talked a little bit about it. Let's talk about the bigger story. So coming off the abdominal aorta, there's the left and right renal arteries. They are then going to go into the kidneys at the hilum and branch into segmental arteries. We'll see this in a moment in a picture. Once you're inside the kidney, there's additional arteries. There's the interlobar, right, in between the lobes that pass up through the renal columns. And then there are arcuate arteries. Arcuate arteries go around an arc. We'll see that in a moment. It's pretty easy to see when you see it. Then to the cortical radiate arteries. And the cortical radiate arteries finally branch into those afferent arterioles that we've already seen in the previous diagrams. Again, there's about 1.2, 1.3 million nephrons in every kidney. That means there's also 1.3 or so afferent arterioles in your in each kidney, right? About 2.5 million between your two kidneys. Again, note that no oxygen is being filtered in the glomerulus. Instead, we're simply filtering out those metabolic waste products. So let's take a look here at the big story. Zoom into this, and again, here is the hilum of the kidney, and we see now a lot more going in and out. We see some nerve endings going in. There's the renal artery coming in, the renal vein going out. This diagram is not showing any lymphatics, but there's a couple lymphatics in here as well. So as the renal artery brings blood into the kidney, it's going to go into the segmental artery. It's then going to branch into the interlobar, right? Each of these pyramids is like a lobe, if you will. So interlobar, go up to an arc, the arcuate artery, then go up into the cortex, the cortical radiate arteries, and then from the cortical radiate artery, we now go into the afferent arteriole. This we've already seen. The afferent arteriole leads blood into the glomerulus. Here's a simplified glomerulus for us to see this. Here's the capsule, again simplified. Within the glomerulus, we're filtering out plasma, waste products, leaving out an efferent arteriole. Again, red blood in, red blood out, arterial in, arterial out. The efferent arteriole then travels to another capillary bed. This capillary bed is spread all around the tubes. That's the peritubular capillaries. It's not shown in this rendition, but in these capillaries, you would start to see gas exchange. You'd see some purple colors, if you would, and then blue blood leaving, right, deoxygenated blood, which then comes back to basically a reverse of all of these veins. There's the cortical radiate veins. They then merge into the arcuate vein, into the interlobar vein, and the interlobar vein then drains out the renal vein. The only thing that's not identical is that, notice there's no segmental vein. There is no segmental vein, but the rest of this story is a parallel story as we think about the incoming arterial structures and the outgoing venous structures. No segmental vein. The renal vein is then going to merge back to the inferior vena cava and carry that blood back to the heart. Here's a great little activity to help you order all of these arteries and veins from 1 to 12. You'll also find an activity like this in your green lab manual. This is a great video that reviews all that we've talked about in the urinary system anatomy and nephron structures and everything else. So definitely a high value video. And that brings us to the end of this 25.2 on the microscopic anatomy. Again, make sure you're checking out the questions and doing the labeling activities and checking out the vocab terms as well. So let's finish up taking a look at the gross anatomy of urine transport. That is, once the blood is filtered through the glomerulus and once the filtrate and urine are formed, what happens next? So what we're going to be focusing now is leaving the bladder, leaving the kidney, you go through the ureter, down to the bladder, and then out the urethra. So let's take a look at that, as well as compare and contrast male and female urethras, and take a quick look at the micturition reflex, that is the fancy name for the urination reflex, and talk about how there's both voluntary and involuntary neural control of micturition. So the blood is being filtered into urine at a pretty constant rate throughout the day. Recall that sympathetic parasympathetic has somewhat of a difference in the blood flow to the kidney, but there is never a time where the blood flow to the kidneys is shut off. So remember that the necessity of filtering the blood is a 24/7 activity, and the kidneys never have the opportunity to shut down completely. So the urinary tract shown here would be the ureters, two of them, left and right, coming down, dumping into the kidney, and then leaving the kidney through the urethra. And that's the urinary tract. A urinary tract infection would be an infection somewhere along that urinary tract. So let's take a look at how the urinary structures are in relationship, close relationship to genitals and the reproductive system, as well as some of the digestive structures. So let's start here on the female on panel A. Some books will actually refer to this as the urogenital system because there's such close proximity to the urinary and reproductive structures. So we'll learn about the uterus. So here's the uterus, ovaries, there's your uterine tube or the fallopian tube. We'll talk all about that when we get to the female system. Here is the last part of the large intestine, going down to the rectum and then out the anus. Here you know to expect both the internal and the external anal sphincters. Well, in close proximity, well, here's the uterus and then here's the vagina. In close proximity, here's the bladder and here is the urethra. Okay, and the urethra opens up into the labia and the area referred to as the vulva in the female. Now in the male, the bladder is exactly the same, and we see that it's also in relationship to the digestive system. Of course, the male does not have the vagina and the uterine and ovarian structures up in the abdominal pelvic cavity. If we took my liner, my pointer now, and we just kind of line around here, I am basically lining the peritoneal cavity, right? So that's the peritoneum, the parietal peritoneum. In the female, same thing. Parietal peritoneum, but it wraps over the top of the uterus. And so what we see is that the bladder is underneath the peritoneum. So not only are the kidneys retroperitoneal, but also the bladder is outside of, or you could say underneath, the peritoneum as well. So the kidneys and the ureters are completely retroperitoneal, and the bladder has a little bit that is covered by the superior surface of the bladder, has a little bit of the peritoneum on it as well. Again, the urine has been formed up in the bladder, up in the kidney, is going to travel down, the urine is going to travel down the calyces, merge into the renal pelvis, and then travel down the ureter. The urine is going to pass through the ureter, and down into the bladder itself. There is some peristalsis going on. There's some smooth muscle along the ureter. So just like in the digestive system, there's some rhythmic contractions that help to bring that urine down to the bladder. Of course, gravity helps too, but there is definitely some propulsion going on. And then the urine is going to drive its way into the bladder, and there is a one-way valve that basically allows the urine to go into the bladder without it refluxing or passing back into the ureter. The ureters are about 30 centimeters long. That's 12 inches. Okay, so about a foot long. Now, of course, if you're a taller person, you're going to have longer ureters. If you're a shorter person, you're going to have slightly shorter ureters. There is a lining inside of transitional epithelium. So you have learned up until now that transitional epithelium is found in the bladder. There's also some of that transitional epithelium found along the ureter. There's also some goblet cells along the way that are producing mucus, similar to other mucous membranes. The muscular layer is a double layer of smooth muscle that's going to create that peristaltic contraction similar to the intestines. And finally, there's an outer layer around the ureter called the adventitia, and that is collagen and connective tissues that are helping to adhere the ureters to the parietal peritoneum and the posterior abdominal wall. Don't worry about the histology of the bladder, but just appreciate there's a relatively small lumen, and there's a significant amount of smooth muscle tissue, and then there's that connective tissue layer on the outside, the adventitia. Notice that there's no submucosa. So we have a mucosal layer, we have the muscularis layer, and we have the adventitia, but there's no submucosa. Once the urine has reached the bladder, it is going to drive down into the bladder, and you can see here, let's take a look at this picture. Here are the two ureters coming down from the kidneys. Notice though that the ureters don't drop the urine into the top of the bladder, but instead quite a ways down there are two ureteral openings. These are the two openings for the urine, so it comes down from behind and drips in here. Then the urine is going to start filling up the bladder, and as more and more urine fills, it's going to create some pressure, and we have a muscle. It's smooth muscle. It's all around the inside of the bladder. It's called the detrusor muscle. Recall from vocab, detruse means to force away. So this muscle is going to contract during the micturition reflex, and the muscle is going to contract and push this urine out through the sphincters. Just like the anal region, there are two sphincters involved. First, there's an internal urethral sphincter. You guessed it, it's smooth muscle. It's a continuation with the detrusor muscle. Then, beyond that, there's an external urethral sphincter. Now, the external urethral sphincter is in the same plane as a muscle wall that is referred to as the urogenital diaphragm. Urogenital diaphragm. So we know diaphragm as a term. When you hear the word diaphragm, you think it's the muscle of respiration, and that is true. However, the word diaphragm more generically means divider or partition. So let's go back up for a moment and take a look at the male and female images and take a look at this. And you can see that there is a wall of muscle right here. Okay, so here's the anus, here is the bladder, here is the urethra, and right here, right, is where the external urethral sphincter would be. But you can kind of get the idea that there's a layer of muscle that travels right here. It's not labeled here, but that's that urogenital diaphragm. In the male, it's no different. In the male, there's also this layer of muscle right about here. Right now, these you might also hear these muscles, especially in the female, referred to as pelvic floor muscles. And this may also explain why after childbirth, the vagina can get stretched a little bit and can affect the integrity of this sphincter. And that's why during pregnancy, the as the baby is developing, it's pushing down on the bladder, and that can lead to some incontinence, some leakage, but also in a smaller bladder, right? So pregnant women are having to go to the restroom more often because the pressure on the bladder from the baby is significant. But then after childbirth, some women need to strengthen these pelvic floor muscles to restore normal urinary function, because there is stretching and a little bit of damage, if you will, done to the sphincters of the urethra. So let's go back down to, a little too far, and finish up our conversation here on the bladder. Lining the bladder, as is shown here, we have transitional epithelium, okay? And this representation of the bladder would be a female bladder. And the only reason I suggest that is because right here, if this were male, there would be a walnut-shaped gland, and the prostate gland would be right here in between the internal sphincter and the external sphincter. In the female, right, there's no prostate gland. So what I just said is described here in words. You have the detrusor muscle, right, and you have that transitional epithelium. Sometimes it's referred to as urothelium. I haven't used that word on a test, but you may see that transitional epithelium lining the bladder. A little video about that transitional epithelium. And I showed you the two sphincters, which are developed as sort of your toilet training muscles. And these muscles are also involved with forceful defecation and childbirth, those muscles of the pelvic floor. From here, from the bladder, urine is going to travel out the urethra. Again, let's look at the difference between the male and the female. No difference in the kidneys, no difference in the ureter, no difference in the bladder, and then out the urethra. Again, two sphincters here, internal and external. In the male, however, right, and let me zoom into that over here on this diagram, which I'm having trouble pulling up. Oh, not pulling it up for some reason, but here we'll see there is the prostate gland, and if you zoomed in, which I'm not able to do right now, you would see that the internal sphincter is above the prostate. The external sphincter leading into the urethra is below the prostate. Also note the length of the urethra is significantly different between female and male. The female is much shorter. The male, because the urethra passes through the penis, is a longer tube. This also prevents males, it doesn't prevent, but it minimizes the number of urinary tract infections because of the length of the urethra. And we'll learn in the reproductive system that the prostate actually releases antimicrobial substances, which actually help to minimize bacterial infections in the male. Inside the kidney, there is sort of a triangle-like structure referred to as the trigone. I'll go back up and show that to you in a moment. And I've already described to you the two sphincters. The nerves that control the external sphincter are coming off the pudendal nerve. And this nerve, you know, is a nerve coming off the sacral plexus. You saw this nerve in lab. So it's coming off way down off the sacral plexus, which makes sense, right? The bladder is down in the sacral region. Let's go back up and take a look at the trigone really quick. And it is essentially, the trigone is this triangular arrangement. It is the two ureteral openings and the opening to the urethra. So that's the triangle, the trigone, and that is sort of the funneling region of the internal bladder. The male urethra again has the prostate. Here is the internal sphincter above the prostate. Here's the external sphincter below the prostate. The urethra passes through the prostate and then into the penis. We'll see this next time in the male reproductive. This is the ejaculatory duct, and this is the passageway through which sperm and seminal fluids will pass and join into the urethra upon ejaculation. Talk more about that in the reproductive unit, but you can read about it here, and we'll pick up on that story in the male reproductive unit. Micturition, you don't hear it often, but it's the name, the fancy word for the urinary reflex. You might call it urination or voiding, and regardless, it's a combination of involuntary and voluntary actions. That makes sense to you because the involuntary portion would be the detrusor muscle. Remember that smooth muscle? The internal sphincter is smooth muscle as well. So as urine collects into the bladder, it begins to fill the bladder. That increased pressure down here on the smooth muscle of the internal sphincter gives you the urge to go to the restroom. But isn't it interesting that when you urinate, right, when you then go to the restroom and you now send voluntary signals to release the external sphincters, think about this for a second. The detrusor muscle is going to contract. It's going to squeeze. But at the same time, the sphincter, the internal and the external sphincter are going to relax. Isn't that interesting, right? That in a single activity, quote, urination, that some smooth muscles are contracting, the detrusor, and some smooth muscles are relaxing, the sphincter. So we're not going to be going into the details of that this semester, but it is pretty cool how smooth muscle can respond to nervous signals in different ways, sometimes by constricting, sometimes by relaxing or dilating. And incontinence is whenever a person is not able to voluntarily control the bladder. So then someone is using depends. Now there's a lot of different types of incontinence. I'm not going to ask you about those different types of incontinence, but there's a number of them. And so this is no small problem, if you will. There are lots of reasons for why people would lose control of their urinary functions. Again, the pudendal nerve from the sacral plexus comes over and innervates your sphincters as well as the anus, and is involved both in urinary and in some of the reproductive responses as well. So that brings us to the end of 25.3. I do have just a couple more slides to share with you that I'll talk through here in just a moment. These extra slides are posted in the exam folder just underneath this lecture posting. So just a couple of notes in these PowerPoint slides about the urinary system. Again, the idea of micturition is simply the complex set of reflexes involved in. Remember I talked about how the bladder is both constricting and relaxing different smooth muscles. Plus, you have the voluntary relaxation of the external sphincter. So it's a pretty cool complex of events that are happening. Again, there are stretch receptors in the bladder wall that are activated as the bladder fills, and simultaneously there's some pretty cool things happening as the muscles allow for the release of the urine. Here is an overview of what's happening in the kidney. And let me pause for this slide and go through this. There's a couple of really important things on here. This is a simplified rendition of basically a nephron. So here we have the afferent arteriole coming in. This is a good review. Coming into the glomerulus. Now the glomerulus here is very simplified. It just shows a a vessel here, but this was a capillary bed, and leaving the glomerulus would be the efferent arteriole, and we know the efferent arteriole travels down to the peritubular capillary. You'll see this in lab. The peritubular capillary continues to the vasa recta in just a few of the nephrons, those juxtamedullary nephrons. Let's talk about what else is happening. So as the filtrate is filtered, this arrow here represents the movement of substances from the blood into the tubular structures. This arrow represents the process of filtration. And as we've described, filtration happens across those leaky, fenestrated capillaries of the glomerulus. Once that filtrate enters into the Bowman's capsule or the capsular space, it's going to travel down the nephron. Now, this nephron is shown as one straight tube, but imagine right up about here is sort of the proximal convoluted tubule. And we see this arrow. This arrow represents reabsorption. When the filtration occurs, there's a lot of water that's filtered. There's a lot of glucose. There's all sorts of things that are filtered through those fenestrations that the kidneys need to return to the blood, right? If we lost all of the water and all of the nutrients that are filtered out of the blood, we would not survive very long. So much of what is filtered is immediately reabsorbed. It leaves the proximal tubule, it leaves the tubules, and goes back to the bloodstream. It goes back to the bloodstream in those peritubular capillaries that are wrapped around the tubes. So this arrow represents an important process called reabsorption. This is going to include water, glucose, amino acids, all the stuff that got filtered out but is still important to the body. Let me also say, I didn't mention this earlier, but guys, you are filtering about 180 liters of filtrate a day. And ladies, about 150 liters of filtrate a day. Let's just stop for a second and think about what that means. Recall from our cardiovascular blood unit that you only have 4 to 6 liters of blood. And if we say that plasma is about 50% of that volume, you only have 2 to 3 liters of plasma total. 2 to 3 liters of plasma total. And yet I'm telling you that 150 to 180 liters of plasma are filtered every day. What does that tell us? Our plasma is being filtered over and over and over and over and over every single day in order to get rid of these waste products. So there's no way that we can urinate out all of the filtrate that comes across the glomerulus. So most of it, right? The vast majority of our fluids are going to be reabsorbed, 99%. We only urinate out about 1 liter or 2 a day. So of that 150 to 180 liters, only 1 or 2 liters will make it out into our urine. Most of that fluid is reabsorbed, as is most of our sodium and most of the other important metabolites. Now, there's another process that happens in the kidney between the blood and the kidney tubules, and that is the process of secretion. And that represents this arrow. And what you're seeing is that there are some substances that leave the blood and are shuttled directly into the tubule. There is one substance that I want to tell you about that does this process of secretion. Now, the word secretion doesn't conjure up what it is. Secretion is the movement of molecules from the blood into the tubule. In other words, the body is shuttling materials from the blood directly into what will become the urine. And the one substance that I want you to think about that is secreted is acid, hydrogen ions. Okay, let me ask you this question. You know the answer. What is the pH of your blood? And you should be immediately telling me 7.4. Question. What is the pH of your urine? And the answer is acidic. Okay, your blood is basic, slightly alkaline, pH 7.4. Your urine pH fluctuates throughout the day. It's usually between 4 and 6. Between 4 and 6 acidic. Why does it fluctuate during the day? Based upon your diet. If you eat a lot of foods that are broken down into acidic byproducts, then your pH will be lower. If you exercise, your muscles will release lactic acid. And again, your urine will be more acidic. So think about this for a second. How does your body keep your blood pH so tightly regulated at 7.4? Well, the answer is, as your blood picks up more and more acid, extra acid is shuttled directly back into the tubes and is released in your urine. So this backward arrow is secretion. So definitely know these three processes that are happening in the kidney. There's filtration at the glomerulus, and then there's reabsorption and secretion. These are movements of molecules in opposite directions from the capillaries and into the tube. Then from here, right, we have the release of urine from the tubule, and we've talked about that urinary tract. So reabsorption, let's just say it again. Reabsorption is the movement of molecules from the tube, from the filtrate solutions back into the blood. This is primarily happening in the proximal convoluted tubule. And what's happening is that most of the water, proteins, glucose, and electrolytes, we wouldn't want to lose those. So those are being shuttled back into the blood. Water is moving by our favorite process, osmosis. Secretion, again, is the movement of substances out of the blood and into the tubule, what will become our urine. And as I said, the one substance that I want you to know is secreted is extra or unwanted acid in the form of H+ ions. Okay, so we're just looking at that again. We have filtration at the glomerulus. We have reabsorption. Look at the arrow direction from the filtrate back to the blood. We also have secretion from the blood back into the tubule. Remember that along the proximal tubule, you have lots of microvilli helping to increase the surface area to allow for this reabsorptive process to occur. I mentioned in passing, I was going to talk about one hormone. Actually, we're going to talk about a couple of them here. But ADH, antidiuretic hormone, really an important hormone. We're not doing a lot of hormone things this semester. This is really a physiological thing that you'll focus on next semester. But I want to give you just a flavor of what's coming in your physiology class next semester. And that is, ADH is made by your hypothalamus. You know where that is, up in the brain. ADH is released when your body is dehydrated. And another word, antidiuretic, means anti-peeing, right? A diuretic is a medication or something that you take that causes you to urinate. So antidiuretic hormone would be a hormone that tells you not to pee. Now, how does this work? Antidiuretic hormone actually is released by your brain and your pituitary gland. It travels down to the kidney when you are dehydrated and tells your body, do not urinate out the water. It causes more water to be reabsorbed. So ADH leads to a reabsorption of water. That is going to leave your urine more concentrated and darker in color. We all know what happens to our urine when we're dehydrated, right? When you're dehydrated, if it's a hot day and you've not been replacing your liquids, you know that your urine output is smaller in volume and it is darker in color. Your urine is more concentrated and your body has held on to more water. Why? Because your body made this hormone, ADH, in response to that dehydration. So I want you to know about ADH. Now there's another hormone that I want you to know about too while we're on this conversation about urination and fluid levels. And that is, interestingly, a hormone produced by your heart. Did you know that your heart is actually also, in addition to being a cardiovascular organ, but is also an endocrine organ? Your heart does produce a couple of hormones. One of those hormones is atrial natriuretic hormone. Atrial tells us where it's from. It's from the atria. You know where the atria are. Natriuretic. Look at the first 3 or 4 letters, right? Na, you know, is the chemical symbol for sodium. Natrium is Latin for sodium. So we get the Na from the Latin term for sodium, natrium. So it's already telling us what's going on. It's a hormone made by the atria of the heart, something to do with sodium. This hormone is released by the heart when your blood pressure is too high. So when your heart is receiving blood into it from your vena cava and there's too much volume and the blood pressure is too high, what would your heart want to do? Your heart would want to lower your blood pressure. How does it do it? It creates this hormone. This hormone travels to the tubules of your kidney and decreases sodium reabsorption. In other words, this hormone tells your kidneys to pee out more sodium. We learned back in Lab A that when there are more solutes, water follows. So if there's more sodium in your urine, more water will also be in your urine. So when you have higher blood pressure, the heart releases ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone. It tells your kidneys to let more sodium get released in your urine. That increased sodium pulls water with it. And as a result, because you have less volume of blood in your body, you're going to have a lower blood pressure. Again, this is a topic that will be of significance, of tremendous significance in the cardiovascular units next semester as you learn more about the physiology of this. But I wanted to introduce just a couple of these hormonal situations just so you can get a flavor of what is coming your way. So we have ANH. And then finally, you know of 2 other diuretics. You probably know that drinking alcohol causes you to urinate, and drinking caffeine also causes you to urinate. So alcohol and caffeine are both diuretics. How does it work? Alcohol inhibits ADH. Okay? So I told you ADH is released when you're dehydrated, but alcohol inhibits ADH. What does this mean? This means that if you drink alcohol, you are going to pee because your body no longer can regulate your urination through ADH. So it works the same way, right? Remember that ADH is pulling water back in. Well, if ADH can't pull that water back in, that means that more water will end up in your urine. So that's how alcohol works. It inhibits ADH. Caffeine, however, works a different mechanism. Caffeine works basically the same way as ANH. So if you want to make a note, right, you can put that ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone, and caffeine basically have the same effect, and that is they inhibit that sodium reabsorption. So imagine now drinking an alcoholic drink that has caffeine in it, right? So if you use any sort of Red Bull as a mixer with alcohol, vodka and Red Bull or something, or you have rum and Coke that has caffeine in it, when you mix alcohol and caffeine, you're getting a double whammy of diuretics. And you're not only inhibiting ADH, but you're also inhibiting sodium reabsorption. So together, you're going to have a very significant outflow shortly after consuming that double diuretic drink. This is also a warning. You don't want to be drinking alcohol and caffeine when you are dehydrated, right? If your body's already dehydrated, you don't want to add to it by drinking alcohol and caffeine. Make sure you are also drinking water to counter the diuretic effects of these substances. And finally, what happens as we get older? As we get older, our urinary system, like all of our other systems, is going to become less efficient. This is going to start happening around the age of 30. The kidney's getting a little bit smaller in size. There will be a little bit less blood flow going to the kidneys. That means, right, that there will be a little bit less filtration going on. We will lose the number of nephrons that are able to work. That, and also the reabsorption and secretion processes will be a little bit reduced. That ultimately means that we'll have less ability to filter our blood. We'll start producing less ADH. Don't worry about the aldosterone. But we'll start producing a little bit less ADH, and that means we'll have less ability to control our blood volume, and we'll have less ability to control our blood pressure. A lot of individuals, right, as they get older, start having issues with blood pressure. This is part of it. This is why. The kidneys are no longer working as efficiently as they used to. ADH is no longer being produced the way it should. And so there's a number of other blood pressure regulating things that the kidneys can no longer do very well. Also with age, the bladder gets a little bit smaller. That means that we're going to have to go to the restroom more often. And with age, sometimes comes the inability to control the sphincters. And so you might lose your ability to control your urination processes, your micturition reflex, which of course leads to what we call incontinence. So that brings us to just a few more facts about the urinary system, and that finishes up our conversation on this very important topic for this exam.